Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series in Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson with Chapter 25, The Lesson Restated. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, we are doing this series as a parallel read with Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies, which we've just finished. So I'll put a link in this video's description so you can follow along with that series as well. As I've also mentioned throughout the course of this series, at the end of each read, we'll be doing an analysis and review of the read, so I'll put a timestamp in this video's description so you can jump straight to the analysis and review part of the video if that's how you'd like to go about things. Finally, as this is one of the longer reads, Hazlitt has, as he has done throughout the course of this series, broken this read up into several parts. In this case, he's labeled them entirely numerically and has not inserted a label for part 1, so I'll be inserting that after I read the chapter's title. So with all that out of the way, let's dive into tonight's read, which is Chapter 25, The Lesson Restated, Part 1. Economics, as we have now seen again and again, is a science of recognizing secondary consequences. It is also a science of seeing general consequences. It is the science of tracing the effects of some proposed or existing policy, not only on some special interest in the short run, but on the general interest in the long run. This is the lesson that has been the special concern of this book. We stated it first in skeleton form, and then put flesh and skin on it through more than a score of practical applications. But in the course of specific illustration, we have found hints of other general lessons, and we should do well to state these lessons to ourselves more clearly. In seeing that economics is a science of tracing consequences, we must have become aware that, like logic and mathematics, it is a science of recognizing inevitable implications. We may illustrate this by an elementary equation in algebra. Suppose we say that if x equals 5, then x plus y equals 12. The solution to this equation is that y equals 7. But this is so precisely because the equation tells us, in effect, that y equals 7. It does not make that assertion directly, but it inevitably implies it. What is true of this elementary equation is true of the most complicated and abstruse equations encountered in mathematics. The answer already lies in the statement of the problem. It must, it is true, be quote-unquote worked out. The result, it is true, may sometimes come to the man who works out the equation as a stunning surprise. He may even have a sense of discovering something entirely new, a thrill like that of, quote, some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, end quote. His sense of discovery may be justified by the theoretical or practical consequences of his answer. Yet the answer was already contained in the formulation of the problem. It was merely not recognized at once. For mathematics reminds us that inevitable implications are not necessarily obvious implications. All this is equally true of economics. In this respect, economics might be compared also to engineering. When an engineer has a problem, he must first determine all the facts bearing on that problem. If he designs a bridge to span 2 points, he must first know the exact distance between these 2 points, their precise topographical nature, the maximum load his bridge will be designed to carry, the tensile and compressive strength of the steel or other material of which the bridge is to be built, and the stresses and strains to which it might be subjected. Much of this factual research has already been done for him by others. His predecessors also have already evolved elaborate mathematical equations by which, knowing the strength of his materials and the stresses to which they will be subjected, he can determine the necessary diameter, shape, number, and structure of his towers, cables, and girders. In the same way, the economist, assigned a practical problem, must both know the essential facts of that problem and the valid deductions to be drawn from those facts. The deductive side of economics is no less important than the factual. One can say, of it what Santayana says of logic, and what could equally be well said of mathematics, that it, quote, traces the radiation of truth, end quote, so that, quote, when one term of a logical system is known to describe a fact, the whole system attaching to that term becomes, as it were, incandescent, end quote. Now, few people recognize the necessary implications of the economic statements they are constantly making. When they say that the way to economic salvation is to increase credit, it is just as if they said that the way to economic salvation is to increase debt. These are different names for the same thing seen from opposite sides. When they say that the way to prosperity is to increase farm prices, it is like saying that the way to prosperity is to make food dearer for the city worker. When they say that the way to national wealth is to pay out governmental subsidies, they are in effect saying that the way to national wealth is to increase taxes. When they make it a main objective to increase exports, most of them do not realize that they necessarily make it a main objective ultimately to increase imports. When they say, under nearly all conditions, that the way to recovery is to increase wage rates, they have found only another way of saying that the way to recovery is to increase costs of production. It does not necessarily follow, because each of these propositions, like a coin, has its reverse side, or because the equivalent proposition, or the other name for the remedy, sounds much less attractive, that the original proposal is under all conditions unsound. There may be times when an increase in debt is a minor consideration as against the gains achieved with the borrowed funds, when a government subsidy is unavoidable to achieve a certain military purpose, when a given industry can afford an increase in production costs, and so on. But we ought to make sure in each case that both sides of the coin have been considered, that all the implications of a proposal have been studied, and this is seldom done. Part 2. The analysis of our illustrations has taught us another incidental lesson. This is that, when we study the effects of various proposals, not merely on special groups in the short run, but on all groups in the long run, the conclusions we arrive at usually correspond with those of unsophisticated common sense. It would not occur to anyone unacquainted with the prevailing economic half-literacy that it is good to have windows broken and cities destroyed, that it is anything but waste to create needless public projects, that it is dangerous to let idle hordes of men return to work, that machines which increase the production of wealth and economize human effort are to be dreaded, that obstructions to free production and free consumption increase wealth, that a nation grows richer by forcing other nations to take its goods for less than they cost to produce, that saving is stupid or wicked, and that squandering brings prosperity. Quote, "What is prudence in the conduct of every private family," end quote, said Adam Smith's strong common sense in reply to the sophists of his time, quote, "can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom," end quote. But lesser men get lost in complications. They do not re-examine their reasoning even when they emerge with conclusions that are palpably absurd. The reader, depending upon his own beliefs, may or may not accept the aphorism of Bacon that, quote, "a little philosophy inclineth men's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion," end quote. It is certainly true, however, that a little economics can easily lead to the paradoxical and preposterous conclusions we have just rehearsed, but that depth in economics brings men back to common sense. For depth in economics consists in looking for all the consequences of a policy instead of merely resting one's gaze on those immediately visible. Part 3. In the course of our study also, we have rediscovered an old friend. He is the forgotten man of William Graham Sumner. The reader will remember that in Sumner's essay, which appeared in 1883, quote, "As soon as A observes something which seems to him to be wrong, from which X is suffering, A talks it over with B, and A and B then propose to get a law passed to remedy the evil and help X. Their law always proposes to determine what C shall do for X, or, in the better case, what A, B, and C shall do for X. What I want to do is look up C. I call him the forgotten man. He is the man who never is thought of. He is the victim of the reformer, social speculator, and philanthropist. And I hope to show you before I get through that he deserves your notice both for his character and for the many burdens which are laid upon him." End quote. It is a historic irony that when this phrase, the forgotten man, was revived in the 1930s, it was applied not to C, but to X, and C, who was then being asked to support still more X's, was more completely forgotten than ever. It is C, the forgotten man, who is always called upon to stench the politician's bleeding heart by paying for his vicarious generosity. Part 4. Our study of our lesson would not be complete if, before we took leave of it, we neglected to observe that the fundamental fallacy with which we have been considered arises not accidentally, but systematically. It is an almost inevitable result, in fact, of the division of labor. In a primitive community, or among pioneers, before the division of labor has arisen, a man works solely for himself or his immediate family. What he consumes is identical with what he produces. There is always a direct and immediate connection between his output and his satisfactions. But when an elaborate and minute division of labor has set in, this direct and immediate connection ceases to exist. I do not make all the things I consume, but perhaps only one of them. With the income I derive from making this one commodity or rendering this one service, I buy all the rest. I wish the price of everything I buy to be low, but it is in my interest for the price of the commodity or services that I have to sell to be high. Therefore, though I wish to see abundance in everything else, it is in my interest for scarcity to exist in the very thing that it is my business to supply. The greater the scarcity compared to everything else, in this one thing that I supply, the higher will be the reward that I can get for my efforts. This does not necessarily mean that I will restrict my own efforts or my own output. In fact, if I am only one of a substantial number of people supplying that commodity or service, and if free competition exists in my line, this individual restriction will not pay me. On the contrary, if I am a grower of wheat, say, I want my particular crop to be as large as possible. But if I'm concerned only with my own material welfare and have no humanitarian scruples, I want the output of all other wheat growers to be as low as possible. For I want scarcity in wheat and in any foodstuff that can be substituted for it, so that my particular crop may command the highest possible price. Ordinarily, these selfish feelings would have no effect on the total production of wheat. Wherever competition exists, in fact, each producer is compelled to put forth his utmost efforts to raise the highest possible crop on his own land. In this way, the forces of self-interest, which, for good or evil, are more persistently powerful than those of altruism, are harnessed to maximum output. But if it is possible for wheat growers or any other group of producers to combine to eliminate competition, and if the government permits or encourages such a course, the situation changes. The wheat growers may be able to persuade the national government, or better, a world organization, to force all of them to reduce pro rata the acreage planted to wheat. In this way, they will bring about a shortage and raise the price of wheat. And if the rise in the price per bushel is proportionately greater, as it well may be, than the reduction in output, then the wheat growers as a whole will be better off. They will get more money. They will be able to buy more of everything else. Everybody else, it is true, will be worse off, because other things being equal, everyone else will have to give more of what he produces to get less of what the wheat grower produces. So the nation as a whole will be just that much poorer. It will be poorer by the amount of wheat that has not been grown. But those who look only at the wheat farmers will see a gain, and miss the more than offsetting loss. And this applies in every other line. If because of unusual weather conditions there is a sudden increase in the crop of oranges, all the consumers will benefit. The world will be richer by that many more oranges. Oranges will be cheaper. But that very fact may make the orange growers as a group poorer than before, unless the greater supply of oranges compensates or more than compensates for the lower price. Certainly, if under such conditions my particular crop of oranges is no larger than usual, then I am certain to lose by the lower price brought about by general plenty. And what applies to changes in supply applies to changes in demand, whether brought about by new inventions and discoveries or by changes in taste. A new cotton picking machine, though it may reduce the cost of cotton underwear and shirts to everyone, and increase the general wealth, will mean the employment of fewer cotton pickers. A new textile machine, weaving a better cloth at a faster rate, will make thousands of old machines obsolete and wipe out part of the capital value invested in them, so making poor the owners of those machines. The further development of nuclear power, though it can confer unimaginable blessings on mankind, is something that is dreaded by the owners of coal mines and oil wells. Just as there is no technical improvement that would not hurt someone, so there is no change in public taste or morals, even for the better, that would not hurt someone. An increase in sobriety would put thousands of bartenders out of business. A decline in gambling would force croupiers and racing touts to seek more productive occupations. A growth of male chastity would ruin the oldest profession in the world. But it is not merely those who deliberately pander to men's vices who would be hurt by a sudden improvement in public morals. Among those who would be hurt most are precisely those whose business it is to improve those morals. Preachers would have less to complain about, reformers would lose their causes, the demand for their services and contributions for their support would decline. If there were no criminals, we should need fewer lawyers, judges, and firemen, and no jailers, no locksmiths, and, except for such services as untangling traffic snarls, even no policemen. Under a system of division of labor, in short, it is difficult to think of a greater fulfillment of any human need, which would not, at least temporarily, hurt some of the people who have made investments or painfully acquired skill to meet that precise need. If progress were completely even all around the circle, this antagonism between the interests of the whole community and of the specialized group would not, if it were noticed at all, present any serious problem. If in the same year as the world wheat crop increased, my own crop increased in the same proportion, if the crop of oranges and all other agricultural products increased correspondingly, and if the output of all industrial goods also rose and their unit cost of production fell to correspond, then I as a wheat grower would not suffer because the output of wheat has increased. The price that I got for a bushel of wheat might decline. The total sum that I realized for my larger output might decline. But if I could also, because of increased supplies, buy the output of everyone else cheaper, then I should have no real cause to complain. If the decline in the price of my wheat, if the price of everything else dropped in exactly the same ratio as the decline in the price of my wheat, I should be better off, in fact, exactly in proportion to my increased total crop, and everyone else, likewise, would benefit proportionately from the increased supplies of all goods and services. But economic progress never has taken place, and probably never will take place, in this completely uniform way. Advance occurs now in this branch of production and now in that. If there is a sudden increase in the supply of the thing I help to produce, or if a new invention or discovery makes what I produce no longer necessary, then the gain to the world is a tragedy to me and to the productive group to which I belong. Now, it is often not the diffused gain of the increased supply or new discovery that most forcibly strikes even the disinterested observer, but the concentrated loss. The fact that there is more and cheaper coffee for everyone is lost sight of. What is seen is merely that some coffee growers cannot make a living at the lower price. The increased output of shoes at lower cost by the new machines is forgotten. What is seen is a group of men and women thrown out of work. It is altogether proper, it is in fact essential to a full understanding of the problem, that the plight of these groups be recognized, that they be dealt with sympathetically, and that we try to see whether some of the gains from this specialized progress cannot be used to help the victims find a productive role elsewhere. But the solution is never to reduce supplies arbitrarily, to prevent further inventions or discoveries, or to support people for continuing to perform a service that has lost its value. Yet this is what the world has repeatedly sought to do by protective tariffs, by the destruction of machinery, by the burning of coffee, by 1,000 restriction schemes. This is the insane doctrine of wealth through scarcity. It is a doctrine that may always be privately true, unfortunately, for any particular group of producers considered in isolation, if they can make scarce the one thing they have to sell while keeping abundant all the things they have to buy. But it is a doctrine that is always publicly false. It can never be applied all around the circle, for its application would mean economic suicide. And this is our lesson in its most generalized form. For many things that seem to be true when we concentrate on a single economic group are seen to be illusions when the interests of everyone, as consumer no less than as producer, are considered. To see the problem as a whole and not in fragments, that is the goal of economic science. That concludes tonight's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So I'm going to try to keep this short and sweet because, as the title reads, this is nothing more than a restatement of the central lesson, which is an extrapolation of the broken window fallacy, which we have beaten to absolute death in this series of reads. So I don't think we need to go into any further on this. It's also kind of a more or less condensed restatement of the 1,200 pages within The Wealth of Nations. Everything that Hazlitt says in this chapter and throughout basically the course of this read, all of the lessons that can be gleaned, especially from this chapter, are statements that Adam Smith kind of discovered already in 1776, 150 or so, more than 150 years before Hazlitt released Economics in One Lesson. The one thing that he kind of missed in this chapter, and we're going to come back to some of the greater lessons to be learned from the chapter. But the one thing missed that I kind of wish he included in this chapter is the subjective nature of value. It's kind of extrapolated from Smith's lesson, which we've beaten to absolute death on this channel. That when you have mutually consensual transactions, both parties necessarily win. You would not change your good or service for another good or service unless you perceive the value of the service that you're exchanging to be less than the good or service that you're getting. And that's true for the other party as well. You would not have consent in these transactions if one party thought that they were losing. Of course, if you have a market economy and if you have a situation where adults who are consenting are allowed to make consensual transactions, mutually consensual transactions. I wish that he had mentioned he had at least touched up on how the nature of value is that it is subjective and not objective, and of course that value is reflected in the price of things. It's reflected in how much of a thing that your thing can fetch in a market environment. It's reflected if we're talking about the amount of labor that goes into the ferrying services for Farrier Smith. All we have to do is see how many oats Farrier Smith can get from Farmer Brown to shoe Farmer Brown's horses. And if we're going to just look at the labor alone, all we have to do is say, well, how many oats is Brown willing to exchange, for the ore itself, for the iron itself, and to just have himself do the ferrying? Well, the difference between that and what he winds up paying Farrier Smith, which will always be less than what he's willing to pay Farrier Smith, that's the labor value, right? That's the value to Farmer Brown. Of course, the value to someone else may not be that number of oats. In fact, Smith may not have every single farmer in town. There might be another Smith that's willing to conduct his services at a lower price, and maybe, let's say, the grade of the quality of his service and his craftsmanship isn't as good as Farrier Smith, but Farrier Jones, let's say, has other clients that just want the cheaper service. So they're not willing to see that value from Farrier Smith as being of equal value to what Farrier Jones does. So again, all of that value is reflected in the price of things, which of course is constantly fluctuating based on the subjective vision of the people engaging in those transactions. I'll have to this goes against, of course, the labor theory of value, and I will at some point have to do a video on the labor theory of value, which just short version is that it's just manifestly and observably false. We can see this when you go to the gas station and buy a candy bar, that if the price of the candy bar is, we can see that anytime we engage in any transaction ever, that the value of the thing is obviously subjective, and therefore it's going to be represented in what can be exchanged in a mutually consensual transaction for that thing. If I take a dump in a box, I won't be able to get anything for that dump in a box, no matter how much work it was taking a dump in that box. So again, I'll have to do a video on that, but I really wished that in this chapter, because this was the place to do it, that from these lessons that we've had throughout the course of this read, Hazlitt had extrapolated the lesson that Smith basically comes right out and says, which is that the nature of value is that it is subjective, and is represented, of course, by what the thing will exchange for in terms of its equality in the scales, in the vision of value to another thing. So one of the great things that he does in this chapter is that he points out that we can deduce other lessons from that original lesson. One of the complaints I had in my original review of the book, and I'll have to do a re-review of this book in post, is that it's kind of beating a dead horse with this. It's kind of beating you over the head with this lesson. He spends 20-something chapters just, here's how this lesson can be applied here. Here's how this lesson can be applied here. And if you're like me, by about chapter 4 or 5, I was like, okay, I get it, right? I don't need the remaining 20-something chapters. Chapters 4 through 5 is really all I need. But he does point out that from this lesson, we can deduce other lessons. And the same way that we can deduce, we can make deductions from the laws of economics. Now, a law in any science is something that is fundamentally true. It's a statement of an observation. It's not how something has come to be. It's that something has come to be. It's describing the thing, not explaining the thing. So in the case of, say, like the laws of supply and demand, it doesn't matter how you label these things. It doesn't matter what words you use to describe the law of supply and the law of demand. They will always be the law of supply and the law of demand. In the case of the law of demand, just very briefly, of course, as the price for a good or service tends to increase, the amount of it that will sell, the quantity of which is demanded, will tend to decrease. We can, of course, deduce from that statements like, price controls cause shortages. And we talked about the differences, of course, between proofs and evidence. We did that in, I forget which episode it was, but we talked about that on our series on Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies. So do check that out. Click on that link and to check that out, because we did talk about that several times throughout the course of that read, the difference between a proof and versus evidence. In the case of, say, evidence, what we're talking about is the difference between deduction, and induction. So what we can do is, with the laws of economics, the laws of supply and demand, let's say, you can deduce from that logically certain other conclusions. We don't have to go out into the world and infer from our observations of the world what the conclusion might be. In the same way that if I told you 2 was 1 more than 1, 1 more than 1 was 2, 1 more than 2 is 3, 1 more than 3 is 4, and 1 more than 4 is 5, you would be able to deduce logically that 2 more than 2 is 4, not 5. And of course, I'm purposely using 2 plus 2 equals 4, not 2 plus 2 equals 5, as a direct reference to 1984, which I actually am in the middle of doing a review of, so stay tuned for that. The point is that I don't need to count jelly beans. I can just logically deduce that if 2 is 1 more than 1, and if 3 is 1 more than 2, and 4 is 1 more than 3, and 2 is 1 more than 1, then I know that there's 2 more than 2 to make a 4. I don't have to spill jelly beans out onto my tabletop here, to my desktop here, and count out, well, there's 2 jelly beans, there's 2 more jelly beans, 1, 2, 3, 4 jelly beans. I don't need to observe that. I can deduce that logically. And in fact, because I can deduce that logically, I can say that 2 more than 2 of anything will always be 4 of the thing, no matter how many times I test that hypothesis. It's actually not only more useful and more effective, but it also arrives at the proper conclusion significantly more consistently. Which is to say, of course, that if I count jelly beans, I'm subjecting myself to observer error. Maybe I'm miscounting the jelly beans. Maybe I'm not maybe if I count the jelly beans that same way 10,000 times, 2 or 3 times I wind up with 2 plus 2 equals 5. So then if we extrapolate from that what 2 plus 2 equals, does it equal 4 or does it equal 4.000000001? Right? In this way, deduction is significantly more powerful of a tool than induction. And where we have those competing interests, we should always be relying on deduction. Where we have a question of in the case of do price controls cause shortages? Well, if I can prove that, like I talked about, the difference between proofs and evidence, if I can prove that by deductive logical reasoning from the already existing laws of economics, then whatever conclusions you're coming from testing something in the practical sense aren't going to be as useful or valuable or, in many cases, valid as deductive reasoning. And of course, I'm doing this on purpose. I'm saying it this way on purpose because the 2021 Nobel Prize Committee for Economics awarded the Nobel Prize to a group of people, mostly to a single person, basically based on a career body of work proving induction ought, without limitation, supplant deduction, which allows them, of course, to say certain things in economics that are just observably not true and that logically can't possibly be true, but are convenient to a certain political narrative. And it just speaks to how the Nobel Prize Committee has been, especially in economics, has been completely consumed by politics, which is a shame. The big thing that Hazlitt gets right in this chapter, and of course throughout the course of this series of reads, is that humans are flawed creatures. Now, if you're looking for quotes for tonight, there's not going to be any because this is going to be pretty short. I'll be done on this in about 2 or 3 minutes. There's not really much to extrapolate from this. Humans are necessarily flawed creatures. We are not angels. We are not gods among men. It is not the business of economic science to fantasize about humans as they might most romantically be portrayed. So if we're trying to get to a world where human beings are angels, it's just never going to happen. Human beings are, and these are kind of the axioms that we establish a prioristically before we have any knowledge of the world. We just accept that human beings are flawed creatures. We are not perfect creatures. So there's no point in trying to build an economic system based on human beings as creatures without flaw. Marx. Yes, that was a shot across the bow to Marx and Das Kapital, which I really don't want to have to read, but you guys let me know. Let me know if that's something you want me to get into. It's like 2,100 pages long, so I kind of don't want to. So and by the way, this is a huge part of why the socialists are wrong, because human beings are flawed creatures. We are not without flaw. We are not perfect creatures, and as a result, all of the axioms and principles upon which socialism has been founded just can't possibly come to fruition. There is one thing, and I just talked about one of the things that he gets right, and that's great, is that he comes right out and says human beings are flawed creatures. The only thing he really gets wrong, and it's kind of an aside, So I don't know how much weight to put into him getting this wrong. He does make a claim that if people were more, how would I put this, pious, if people were less morally flawed, we wouldn't need preachers. That's just not true. It kind of speaks to a metaethics and a metaphysics problem that I don't think he has quite resolved here. Humans have axioms by which we live. We can't logic them out. We can't resolve all of these metaphysical problems with logic alone because we're human beings. We are flawed creatures. Humans will always, therefore, make a religion of something. Right. The religion being the thing that you will subscribe to a prioristically, these axioms you will subscribe to a prioristically. And of course, all that will happen is that the preachers will go by another name and the worshipped gods will have a new face. If the last 2 years haven't been proof enough of that. So that was tonight's read. It was, again, just basically concluding and summarizing everything we've already gone over throughout the course of this series. Our next read in Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson is going to be not quite our final read, but it's the final read that actually counts as a read, because the final read is actually just a note on books. That's about a page and a half of recommendations for further reading that Hazlitt makes, which we will be doing in this channel. But with that out of the way, the next read will basically conclude the book, and that will be in chapter 26, The Lesson After 30 Years. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.